House rules. Each speaker has 5 minutes. The first and last minutes are protected. The judge will ring a bell to signal the protected time. The bell will ring continuously after 5 minutes.
Economic sanctions undermine effective dialogue. So I think particularly for this particular resolution, we may have to go back to precisely how wars begin or for the start of the wars. I think most probably the beginning of a war is characterized by a sort of superior complex between two sides. We think that we imagine a situation where one side feels bigger, or Russia feels bigger than Ukraine, China bigger than Taiwan, and the Hutus bigger than the Tutsi. That particularly means that in any war, there's a superior complex. There's someone who feels like they're the bigger person, and their goal is most probably to prove that at the end of the war, or inevitably. But then also, we think that both of these people cannot come to terms to any particular situation. We also acknowledge, however, that in the course of a war, there's most probably a lot of things being lost. This just goes to show you the sort of urgency of the matter. We then, however, believe that in a war, a lot of lives are being lost, but then also the economic structures of particular countries are being damaged. What we then go ahead to believe is in a particular situation, when a particular party feels bigger than the other, we then strive to then make people come to a round table and feel the same. A problem comes when you make people feel like a way for them to come down is by infringing more laws on this particular sides. An idea is when sanctions were infringed, when sanctions were put on Russia in the Russia-Ukraine war by NATO, the idealistic goal was to make Russia come down. Ideally, that ought to have happened, but that did not happen. Particularly why? Because Russia felt superior, and Russia's goal was to prove that even with NATO's influence, even with the sanctions, it can still be the bigger party at the end of the day. That just means that when you have two particular people at a war, the worst possible solution is to make someone or give someone the drive or the incentive to prove their essentiality. That creates what we then term as retaliation. So we think that sanctions then invoke retaliation in people, and then that just goes to show, to make them prove a sort of superiority complex on the other hand. Now the problem with that is it accelerates the war. If the goal is to end the war and you are accelerating the war, then the idea is that you are not achieving what you're supposed to be achieving. If the idea is to end the war, then the team that wins the debate is the one that ends the war in the most time sufficient bracket, but then one that also does not accelerate the war. Then we also then understand, we imagine a particular situation where the sanctions do not work. In a situation where sanctions only just accelerate the period of the war or accelerate the loss that we are having. When that particularly happens, then the end goal or the last possible solution is the most reasonable in the first place. And that is diplomacy. That is effective dialogue. Effective dialogue comprises of when two people or two parties sit down and realize that most probably there is a problem at hand. But then also, we think that effective dialogue can only be so if the two sides do not feel like one of them has been pushed to the wall. Essentially, when you have two groups of people, or when you have the Hutu and the Tutsi sitting in the same room in Arusha and then coming to an agreement, when you do not implement sanctions on one particular person or make them push to a table and make them feel like they ought to prove their superiority at the end of the day, you then have effective dialogue. Essentially what we mean is even when the sanctions do not work, or even when team negator sanctions do not work, at the end of the day, we then ought to have diplomacy. The particular problem is when you opt for sanctions in the first place, you cannot have diplomacy at the end of the day. Or even the effective dialogue then takes a longer time. So on the idea of urgency, we think that sanctions just prolong the war. But even at best, if we reach a particular time within the war where we ought to come up with a solution and we aim for diplomacy, we think diplomacy then also takes a longer time if sanctions were there in the first place. So in the issue of urgency, we think that the team that takes home tonight's debate is a team that then caters for urgency best. But then also, a sort of second idea that we want to drive is the idea of the people who are suffering in the sanctions. We think that the sanctions are not being placed on Vladimir Putin, but the sanctions are being placed on the Republic of Russia. The sanctions are being placed on the people of Uganda. The particular problem with that is that the people then suffer. We have economic paralysis within the country of Uganda when sanctions are being placed on them. So ideally, the problem would be then to then make people suffer through an idea of a lot of war and prolong war, accelerate war, and yet at the end of the day, diplomacy could have proved a much better solution. If you're going to make the people of Uganda suffer through a war and economic paralysis, then it would just not make any sense. Ideally, we think diplomacy is the best, or ideally effective dialogue then just caters for urgency in the first hand. We also think effective dialogue can only be effective if we do not have the sanctions, if we do not push particular parties into corners and make few people like they can come up with a certain decision as one group, or we make people feel like the table is leveled and the grounds are leveled for discussion and compromise in particular warfare decisions. We think that particularly what Team Affirmative fronts for is ending particular wars in Russo-Ukraine affiliated areas in Uganda in the shortest period of time. If Team Negative fronts for acceleration of the war, they front for economic paralysis. Thank you.
Economic sanctions undermine effective dialogue. Now, before we start today's discussion, we first have to understand exactly how economic sanctions work and what they look like. Now, we have to understand firstly that these economic sanctions are placed on countries. These economic sanctions are placed on countries that go ahead and undermine the norms of international law. For example, by violating human rights, by violating treaties, say the treaties that talk about weapon manufacture, nuclear weapon manufacture, and things of that sort. And we also see that economic sanctions are only invoked by countries that are under the UN Security Council. This shows that by all means, that by the time an economic sanction has been pushed onto a country, the decision has undergone enough scrutiny, and the decision is for the better of that country, for the citizens of that country, and the entire world at large, because they have failed to comply with international law. Now, we have to understand how they work. This is how they work. For example, in the case of Russia, Ukraine, for example, we see that a country that they may a country like Russia has gone ahead to defy international law, and they have gone ahead and violated human rights, mass murdering, and all that stuff. We see that a country, for example, the United States of America, on which they largely depend on, will go ahead and put an economic sanction on that country. Now, what do the other countries that actually are allies with the United States? They will go ahead and actually also withdraw their labor, their raw materials to a country like Russia, because they also do not want that economic sanction to be invoked on them themselves. Therefore, we see that an economic sanction actually pressurizes a country that experiences it to actually compromise its decisions in terms of warfare and actually do away with them, because they are suffering in terms of labor. They have reduced equipment, they have reduced raw materials for production, reduced industry, and yet we know that economy is actually the heart of the strength of any country. Now, they come ahead and talk about how economic sanctions will go ahead and cause people to suffer. Yes, that is true, but it is only for a little while, because we know that when people see that their country is experiencing economic sanction, that's when the social contract theory comes in. They will go ahead and apply public pressure onto their country. They will go ahead and labor strike. They will go ahead and riot. What happens in this case? The country is receiving internal and external pressure from outside, from its people, and also from its allies outside, to actually compromise its decisions that it's made in warfare. That is why we see countries like North Korea go ahead to actually reduce the manufacture of nuclear weapons, actually reduce, let us say, at least compromise in terms of how they actually test them and all that stuff. They come and give us a scenario of Russia and Ukraine. We understand, we understand that, yes, the war did not end when Russia experienced those economic sanctions. But what happened, dear house? What Team Affirmative does not come and put to the table, please raise, what Team Affirmative does not come and put to the table is that we do realize that the war was squirreled down to a certain area. That is Kiev. It does not now occur in the entire country of Ukraine, and we see that at least half a loaf is better than none. We see that when economic sanctions were put into place, there was no better alternative to bring about to squirrel down this war, to come into a certain area and not in the entire state of Ukraine. Now, what do we say, dear house? As Team Affirmative as Team Negative, we would like to come and tell you that effective dialogue does not stop at coming together, organizing many meetings and all that stuff, as people are actually facing devastation, murder, and all that stuff. What we see in economic dialogue is characterized by goals. Countries come together and set goals. They come together and have mutual benefits, that you get this and I get that. We come together and we see that we have, we see that both countries or both parties that actually experiences that are actually coming for effective dialogue have win-wins and it yields results. However, what do we see with diplomacy that they advocate for? Diplomacy is slow. It is as slow as eating food using an ice cream spoon. We see that as you are making meetings, as you are organizing meetings, the next one postponed, the next consensus, and again, people are actually experiencing pain and devastation. However, when you go ahead and force an economic sanction, people, like I said, an economic sanction will provide internal and external pressure. As soon as possible, it doesn't undermine agency, rather it promotes agency. We see that these countries are going to come, the ones that have received economic sanctions, and actually come and ask for the effective dialogue themselves. We see that economic sanctions do not undermine the effective dialogue. What do? They rather embrace the effective dialogue. They promote effective dialogue, because now if they are advocating for diplomacy, for how many years has diplomacy worked? For how many years has the Russia-Ukraine war worked? For how many years has the Israeli-Palestine war worked? But if we actually continue embracing economic sanctions, we shall work with that. Thank you.
This is the High School Crossfire. We'll be back in a minute.